kept bachelor's hall at the mouth of the Toutle, fed his customers on hardtack 3 times a day, if perchance anyone was unfortunate enough to take 3 meals at his place. Ezra continues, he says, I found the little wife had not fared any better than I had on the trail, and in fact not so well, for the floor on the cabin was a good deal harder than the sand spit where I had passed the night with plenty of pure, fresh air, while she, in the closed cabin, in the same room with many others, could neither boast of fresh air nor freedom from creeping things that make life miserable. With her shoes for a pillow, a shawl for covering, small wonder the report came, I did not sleep a wink last night. Well, one more day on the trail, the river, placed them at these travelers at the Cowlitz Landing. Let's take another look at the map. This map is not for projection. Well, we're talking about Cowlitz Landing right here. Up the Cowlitz River to that point. Hardgrett's place was right here at the mouth of the Toutle. This is someone's depiction of Cowlitz Landing. It was situated about 1 1/4 miles downstream from the present-day town of Toledo, Washington. By 1853, it had become of great importance to those traveling between the Columbia River and the Puget Sound country. Cowlitz Landing was the jumping-off place for those heading overland to Puget Sound. It was here in the Clark Hotel that the first Territorial Separation Convention was held in 1851. Now, today, not a vestige of this town remains. Over years, the Cowlitz River has repeatedly changed its course and eroded away the land once occupied by Cowlitz Landing. But based on past and present surveys of this area, the approximate location of Cowlitz Landing site is shown in this photograph. Willis' story continues. It took us over a week to walk to Olympia. We walked 2 or 3 miles through deep mud and swamps opposite Chehalis, which in those days used to be called Saunders Bottom. There was a sawmill at New Market, and Olympia had a few houses, really just cabins, with a real boarding house with plenty of good food. Well, this is the other part of the map with the view. But from Cowlitz Landing, then they came up and went through Chehalis and Centralia. Tenino sits right out there, and on into Olympia. As I say, it follows pretty much the old highway. With respect to Olympia, let us digress for a moment. Isaac Stevens would arrive in Olympia later that same year, November 26, 1853, to take over his position as first governor of the Washington Territory. He came from the field where he headed a government survey for a Northern Continental Railroad route. Following are his remarks regarding the trip north on the Cowlitz. He says, I was 4 days going up the Cowlitz in drenching rain, and 2 nights I had the pleasure of camping out. I will advise voyagers in the interior when getting suddenly into the rain west of the Cascades to take off their buckskin underclothing. He says, I neglected to do this, and among the many discomfortabilities of the trip up the Cowlitz was to have the underclothing of buckskin wet entirely through. Well, his wife and family, however, did not arrive until December of the following year, having come by sea and through the Panama. Mrs. Stevens describes their journey up the Cowlitz River as follows. As we were sitting flat on the bottom of the canoe, the position became irksome and painful. We were all day long on the Cowlitz River. At night, I could not stand on my feet for some time after landing. We walked ankle deep in mud to a small log house where we had a good meal. Here we found a number of rough, dirty-looking men with pantaloons tucked inside their boots and so much hair on their heads and faces, they all looked alike. Apparently conditions hadn't improved in years prior. Also, with respect to Olympia, George B. McClellan, under Stevens, had been assigned to the task of searching for a railroad route through the Cascade Mountains, and later to become a rather ineffective commander in the Union Army during the Civil War, also arrived in Olympia the fall of 1853 to spend the winter. He was not impressed with our winter weather, stating in a letter to his mother, he says, "I expect to spend the winter in a tent, labored by rain and mud, for you must know that we don't expect to see the sun anymore until next summer." I don't think much of this country. It is surely overrated in every respect. Now back to Willis's story and his friend going to Olympia. We only stopped overnight in Olympia. In the morning we met 3 other fellows who wanted to go to Steilacoom. So the 5 of us hired a boat, sort of a yawl, to take us as far as Fort Nisqually. From there, we walked 8 or 9 miles to Steilacoom. Here we began looking for work and soon met Lafayette Balch, who informed us that he needed some men to go over to Henderson's Bay to work in the timber camp. We made arrangements to go to work the next day at Henderson Bay at $75 per month and board. Now the community of Steilacoom was founded by Lafayette Balch in 1851. Later in the year of 1850, he had brought 2 ships loads with merchandise to Puget Sound. Having stopped at Olympia, he decided it did not meet his business needs and sailed northward on the Sound, where he formed his own town a few miles south of present-day Tacoma. By donating money for civil needs such as Masonic Lodge, courthouse, school, and the first church to be built in the southern Puget Sound area, he encouraged pioneers to settle nearby. Steilacoom during its early years had high hopes of being the hub of Puget Sound country, but it was soon be overshadowed by the development of Tacoma and Seattle. Willis's story continues. I had been in the logging camp a month when they decided they needed a woman's cook, and if I would bring my wife over, they would pay her $50 a month to cook for the camp. So I went back to Portland. Now, when Mary Ann was confronted with the job offer, she's quoted as saying, "Yes, I'll cook. I'll work at anything that will earn money enough to take us home, away from this awfully lonely country." So, as Willis says, we left Portland. And he said, I shipped my wagon on a seagoing sailing vessel from Portland to Steilacoom and took passage with a Captain Windsor, who had a large bateau, which was a big canoe-like boat that operated between Portland and the Cowlitz Landing. This is Mr. and Mrs. Windsor. Several families had decided to go on this trip. The boat was just large enough for passengers and the crew only. When we came to Cowlitz River, it took passengers as well as crew to get that boat upstream because the current was so terrific. We worked her foot by foot, fastening the rope to big trees ahead, and every able-bodied man doing his share of pulling. Those of us not busy on the ropes pulled. There's a picture that depicts that. When we finally got to Cowlitz Landing, I went to my wife and found her feeling pretty miserable. "I've caught cold, Willis," she said. Well, she went on to state that she was losing her eyesight. Well, to make a long story short, she and several others from the group, including several small children, had contracted measles. So Willis says, "I led her up to the house. There was nothing much we could do. Nobody knew how to treat such a strange eye trouble. We just went on." Even though Marianne was ill, they started out on foot for the Cowlitz Landing for Olympia. Eventually they came upon a man with a wagon, but without a team. Inasmuch as their party had 2 oxen, but no wagon, they combined their resources and managed to get the sickly little group safely to Olympia. The next day they hired an Indian to take them by canoe to Henderson Bay, where they both worked for about 2 months. They then returned to Steilacoom and built a boarding house. All of the time they were set on going home to Illinois. Willis continues by saying, "Day after day we looked for mail that might learn what had happened since we left Illinois. Weeks passed and no news came. We had left home in March of 1852, and it was July of 53 before we got a letter. And when that letter came, it brought the sad news of the death of my wife's mother. It was then that we gave up hope of going home. We decided we might as well stay." It was that fall in 1853, while the Boatmans were living in Steilacoom, that the first wagon train of some 180 people arrived in the area by way of the Natchez Pass through the Cascade Mountains. This was a major influx to the population of Puget Sound country. Many of these immigrants were to become friends of the Boatmans and later on join them in settling the Puyallup Valley. Although some of our travelers had reached their Puget Sound destination, their lives in this then frontier land had just begun. The Boatmans, after about 8 months in Steilacoom, sold their boarding house, and on January 11th, took out a donation land claim in the Puyallup Valley. They remained on their claim in this cabin until the fall of 1855, when they were compelled to return to Fort Steilacoom for protection during the Indian Uprising of 1855 and 6. By 1856, the Boatmans were located near Gravelly Lake on some 600 acres extending from 12th Street of today to about a quarter of a mile south and east to Bridgeport Way. Willis built a house